study in Revelation here in just a few weeks. For those of you that have joined us by the internet, it's fantastic having you with us today. Thank you for taking time from your schedule to tune our direction and give us your attention. I appreciate that. I don't take it for granted. There was a talented Irish poet that lived years ago by the name of Jonathan Swift. You may know his name. In all likelihood, you don't recognize it because most of the time the works that he published, he did so under a pseudonym. He was known for his deadpan humor. You may recognize his 1726 writing, that being Gulliver's Travels. But this talented poet, this man of prose and incredible artistic ability in the world of writing, made this statement. He said, "There is nothing constant in this world but inconsistency." There is nothing constant in this world but inconsistency. And I think that if you've lived on this earth for any time at all, you would have to attest that is absolutely true. There's nothing in this world consistent other than inconsistency, and that's the only constant. If that tongue twister even makes any sense at all, the Bible will attest to that fact on any number of occasions. I can hear the words of King Solomon, Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 1, as he states, "There's nothing new under the sun, because to everything there is a season." There's nothing new. That's the constant. And yet the inconsistency is there's a season for everything. It's almost a paradoxical statement, and yet, again, if you've lived this human experience, you understand exactly what he's saying. The sun will rise in the east tomorrow, but that's about the only thing you can count on. Everything else is subject to change. Changeability is the unquestionable reality in everybody's life. When I think about changeability, I think about Christmas this year as opposed to Christmas last year. Remember what you asked for last year and received as opposed to what you asked for and received this year. Remember where you were Christmas 5 years ago and where you are today, Christmas 2019. Think about what's happened in your life and in your family over the course of the past 12 months. Think about how things have changed in your life and in your family over the past year's time. Changeability is the reality of everybody, but see if this doesn't make sense and doesn't jive with what you've known or what you've come to expect. With changeability comes vulnerability, and there's not a person on the face of the earth that likes to be vulnerable. That's the reason we go out and spend hard-earned money purchasing life insurance policies, hoping that the insurance policy will provide us some sort or some type of guarantee. We try to counteract the uncertainty of life using the dollar bill to provide us that necessary security and that blanket of protection. Vulnerability. Nobody likes it. And yet nobody is exempt from the reality of change. Things change, and much of the time not for the better. As a matter of fact, sometimes change can be absolutely catastrophic, totally upending, completely life-changing, and again, not for the better. When I think about the immutability, though, of God, I think about Hebrews chapter 13. I think it's verse number 5 that says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He's the only thing that you can count on, gang. He's the only one you can depend on, folks. Everything else is shifting sand. Here today and likely gone tomorrow. When I look at examples of changeability in the scriptures, I think of King David, and I use him because when we think of an icon of spirituality in biblical literature, we automatically think of the man that killed Goliath. Remember the story? Goliath standing 9 foot 1 inches tall in the valley of Elah. He roars out, "Send me the best soldier that you have. Send me the finest combatant and the best trained warrior in your ranks. Bring him out to me. Let him do battle with me. And at the end of the day, I'm going to feed his body to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Who is your most gallant gladiator? Who is your bravest soldier? Who is your most powerful warrior? We think of David going out as a child, a teenager, standing in the face of Goliath. And can you see it? Can you see it in your mind's eye? He probably doesn't have enough sense to realize how dangerous this situation is, and yet he says, you blaspheme the armies of the living God. You claim that you're going to feed my bodies to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, but I want you to know I come in the name of the Lord. Why in the name of the Lord? Because when everything else in life is changing, he's the only constant. Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. David, this mighty man of faith, this mighty warrior in battle, the teenage giant slayer. I love that. Don't ever think, young man, young lady, you can't have a significant impact on your culture. One with God is the majority, and don't ever forget that. You can do all things through Christ that strengthens you. Don't let anything drown out that reality from your mind and your thought processes. David, the young man that is anointed king. Where shall we find our next king? Saul has committed 3 grievous sins, and the anointing of leadership has been wrested from off of him. God has removed it by force, but where do we find his replacement? And God speaks to the prophet Samuel and says, fill your horn with oil and travel to the house of Jesse, because it's in that home I have appointed me. I have found me a king. And when Samuel arrives at the home of Jesse, he looks around at all of Jesse's sons. They're far more talented, far better looking, far stronger, far more refined than the younger brother out there tending his father's sheep in the field. But as Samuel gazes and pans these boys, the Spirit of God doesn't whisper anything to his heart. And so Samuel will ask Jesse, don't you have anybody else? And almost in a dismissive manner of fact, Jesse says, yeah, I've got one other boy, but he's out in the field tending to my sheep. He's not the one that you're looking for. Let me tell you, God doesn't see as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. David, the giant of Bible faith. David, the man. Every Sunday school student knows who David is. I mean, he's described in Scripture as the premier example of spiritual excellence. I mean, God himself, just think about God himself giving you his review. I think it's over in Acts chapter 13 and verse 22 where we discover the opinion of God as it regards King David. David's a man after my own heart. Man, how many people in this room would have God say the same thing about them? They're a person after my own heart. That's David. Man, one day, the Bible says he had red hair. It does. He was ruddy of a fair countenance. That means he was redhead. It was a redhead with fair complexion. I want to meet him someday. Somehow I think that we probably are genetically connected. We've got that chromosome, that M119R receptor chromosome. There was an article that came out the other day on the internet, the uniqueness of redheads. How that we're less likely to go bald, but we have far fewer strands of hair, but our strands of hair are thicker than the strands of hair in a brunette or somebody that's got black hair. Therefore, we give the illusion of having more hair than we really have. We have a lower threshold or a lower tolerance of pain. That's why we need more anesthesia when we go under for surgery, and more Novocaine when we have our teeth taken care of. All kind of interesting things about redheads. They're supposed to live longer, even though my ancestry would say otherwise. But I'm going to live to be an old man. That's my intention. Yeah, right. So anyway, David the Red... Oh, that's where I was coming from. David the Redhead. Must have been a handsome man if he was a redhead. And yet the Bible, even though it gives us these glowing stories and this incredible testimony by God himself as it regards who David was, David, we find in Scripture, was a man of intense emotional swings. I mean, he wasn't bipolar, he was just normal. But the truth of the matter is some days we're manic and some days we're depressed. Some days we're up, some days we're down. Some days it's in, other days we're out. I'm not sure about tomorrow. All I know is woe is me today. Does that make any sense? Anybody can connect with what I'm trying to tell you? He was a man of extreme emotional changes. Resolute in his confidence, God can deliver me from the hand of Goliath. At the next minute, plunging himself into the place of feeble despair. Woe is me, for God has forsaken me. Why are you downcast, my soul? God, how long will you hide your face from me? Think of that man. In one breath, he's saying, I can kill Goliath. And in the next episode of life, he's saying, God, why are you hiding from me? That's David. Have you ever felt like David? Have you ever lived his experience? If you say no, bless every one of you that are lying in church this morning. Psalm 42 is our text. I want you, if you don't mind, please, to turn there with me today. Psalm 42, and we're going to focus our attention primarily on verse number 7. And in verse number 7 of Psalm 42, David makes this mystifying statement. He says, deep calls to deep in the waterfalls of God's presence. Deep calls unto deep in the roar of your waterfalls. Now you read that, deep calls unto deep, and you wonder, can I have the title slide for that if you don't mind? Deep calls unto deep in the roar of your waterfalls. All the waves and the breakers crash over me. What does he mean when he says, deep calls unto deep? Well, let's understand the historical context of this statement. David is writing this as he's exiled from his throne. We all know that he becomes the second king over Israel. After King Saul, David replaces him. But now Saul has been deposed from his throne. He has been dethroned. He's in exile running for his life. He's fleeing for his life. There has been a coup d'etat. There's been a governmental insurrection. Somebody is trying not only to depose him and dethrone him, but also take his life. It would be one thing if he were sent into another nation to live out the rest of his life. But the man trying to remove him from the throne doesn't want him living in a neighboring nation. He wants him dead. But what I think intensifies the insurrection and the pain of being run out of office is the fact that the man trying to remove him from office and the man trying to kill him, all the same man, is his son Absalom. I want that to sink in. David has been run out of his kingdom. He's been forced to leave Jerusalem. He's fleeing for his life, and the man that's pursuing him is his own flesh and blood, Absalom. Is there any pain worse than the pain of a child that turns hostile toward a parent that loves them? It happens all the time, and I believe it is part of the end times that we're living in. I believe it's a part of the prophecy that Paul gave concerning unnatural affection. The church takes that phrase and likens it to the LGBTQ movement. It's far more than that. Fathers no longer have a heart for their children. Children no longer have a heart for their parents. And you scratch your heads bewildered. What went wrong in this generation? It doesn't make any sense. And alas, it is completely illogical. It doesn't make any sense. But David is running for his life. Absalom wants him dead. My son wants my throne, and he wants my life. So I asked the question this morning, who's Absalom? Who is this maniac? Who is this maniacal despicable, depraved human being that would try to kill his own father, that would try to take the life of his own father. Absalom is the second son of David. He's not heir to the throne. The older boy is named Amnon. Now watch what he does. Watch what Absalom does. Because there is no rabid thirst, there is no rabid taste like the rabidity found in pride and greed. Greed. I want something that I'm not entitled. And there's the big problem with America. We think that there are things we are entitled to that we are not. I deserve it because after all, I am an American. I was teaching on this morning over the internet during our Sunday school class at 9 o'clock. And I was speaking about wealth and the relativism that comes with wealth. Do you understand the poorest of the poor in this nation is phenomenally wealthy as compared to the majority of the planet? I've been to Western Africa. I've been to Sierra Leone. I've been to Gambia. I've been to Nigeria. I've been to home after home where there's no electricity. There's no running water. The only thing people have to live in is a cardboard shack. I haven't seen this by picture. I've been there in person. So, I think to the other day I sold my auto. I wanted to get completely out of debt. And so I sold I had a nice Infiniti Q40. Paid $15,000 for it. Great deal. Only had like 30,000 miles. Leather, all the amenities, all the bells, all the whistles. And you know what? I got, things just don't mean the same to me as they did 10 years ago or 5 years ago. I sold the car. I would rather not pay a monthly note and drive that piece of junk Toyota Camry I have out there in the parking lot, because that Camry does the same thing the Infiniti does with one exception. It doesn't cost me about $500 a month between insurance and the note. No longer do I care to impress anybody with the automobile I drive. I'd rather have that money and use it for something entertaining. So you go on ahead and drive the car you want to drive. There's nothing wrong with that. Enjoy yourself. Knock yourself out. It's a matter of priorities. But speaking about wealth, we in America are astoundingly wealthy. Now, I am the definition of American middle class. I am poor when it comes to a comparison between my portfolio and Donald Trump's. But realize that Donald Trump is poor when compared to Jeff Bezos. All things being relative. Are we all on the same page out there this morning? I'm trying to see. And so Absalom wants the throne. He wants something he's not entitled to, something his money cannot buy. Amnon is the heir apparent. So what does he do? He calls together his family for a celebration. And before the celebration begins, he meets with his servants, and he tells his servants that at a predetermined time, I am going to give you a certain signal. And when you see the signal, it is your job to kill my brother. And that's exactly what happens. Absalom signals his servants, and his servants kill the older brother Amnon. Absalom takes the life of his own flesh and blood because he's driven by this insatiable desire for power. I deserve it. I'm Absalom. Obviously, in David's mind, that fratricide is unforgivable. There's going to be no reconciliation. As the result of that, Absalom wanders out in the wilderness for 3 years, but after the close of as those 3 years come to a close, he reaches out to one of David's field marshals, Joab, and Joab, he begins to garner a peace accord between David and Absalom. Now watch this. Finally, David agrees to allow Absalom to come and live in the city of Jerusalem. It's another 2 years before David will lay eyes on Absalom. A total of 5 years from the time he killed Amnon till the time he actually sees Absalom face to face. But it's in those, listen to me, it's in those 2 years that David allows him to live in Jerusalem that Absalom is in the process of buying off David's counselors. I'm not saying it well. David shows him grace, says that you can come and live here in Jerusalem, and while he's living in Jerusalem, under the shadow of David's temple, Absalom is blackmailing and bribing David's servants. I mean, some people you just can't trust ever. And some people have no appreciation for the grace and forgiveness we show them. And let me give you this little practical nugget of truth. If somebody you show compassion to doesn't reciprocate or doesn't appreciate, don't live the rest of your life down in the mouth and feeling dejected and hurt. Just brush the dust off your feet, walk away, and move on. Your life is too short to live imprisoned by somebody else's manipulation through unforgiveness. So he uses David's compassion to undermine David's government. He makes these promises. He turns David's administration against him, and finally, even David's most trusted confidant and counselor, Ahithophel. I love that name, Ahithophel, David's number one hand man. He even turns his back on David. And all of that allows Absalom the entry point into the king's palace. If I can get Ahithophel to let down his guard and give me access to the palace as I bring all of these citizens into David's presence. These are the citizens that David saved from the people of Goliath. I guess I'm not saying it well. These are the citizens that David served, allowing them to enjoy unparalleled economic prosperity. The very people that David saved have now sold him out to the promises of Absalom. And here they come storming into the king's palace, and they've got staves drawn, they've got knives poised, and David has no choice but to vacate the throne and run for his life. Because Absalom wants the throne. Never mind the fact that God said Solomon will be the successor. Solomon, I love the story of Solomon because he is the son of Bathsheba. What can possibly come out of the relationship that David has, the adulterous relationship that David had with Bathsheba? When David repented, God changed the situation from one of judgment to one of blessing. And whereas David lost his firstborn son to Bathsheba, the next son would be Solomon, the wisest man to ever live the earth, because there's no limit to what God's grace can do through a repentant heart. I hope I'm making sense up here this morning. And so God's will is being forfeited, sold out for money, and that's the backstory. David's running for his life. Absalom wants him dead. And in verse number 7 of chapter 42, the book of Psalms, David cries out, "Deep calls unto deep." I don't know where he is. All I know is he's on the backside of the wilderness. And in this place of alienation, he cries out, "Deep calls unto deep." Now watch this, in the roar of your waterfalls. Whose waterfalls are these? These are the waterfalls of God. He continues on in verse number 7 and says, "All your waves and all your breakers have crashed over me. Deep calls unto deep. In the roar of your waterfalls, your waves and your breakers, God, they're crashing over me." If you've been to the ocean, you understand the analogy that he's using. I'm being overtaken by the waters of the ocean. And in verse 41, here's what I find so interesting. We sing this psalm all the time. But it's in verse number 1 of chapter 42 that David explains why he's even alive. He says, my life is all about the presence of God. The presence of God is not an afterthought. The presence of God is not something I do if I can fit it into my schedule. The presence of God is not something that I will embrace only if it's convenient. He says in verse 1, as the deer pants for the water brook. That's what we're saying. As the deer panteth for the water. Verse 1, he says, as the deer pants for the water brook, even so. Now watch this. He doesn't say my flesh, but he says my soul longs after God. His flesh may have longed for the throne in Jerusalem. But he's not asking for the throne in Jerusalem to be returned to him. He's asking for the return to the temple of worship so there he can communicate and fellowship with God once again. It speaks about our priority. He says, as the deer pants, panting, that shallow, quick breath. You understand what it means to pant outside during the 105-degree temperatures in Texas after doing yard work? And you come inside. It's an indication that not only do you need oxygen, you also need hydration. Because without proper hydration, the human body can only last, 72 hours, if that. And then all the major organs begin to shut down. What's he telling us here? He's telling us, I'm gasping for breath because I'm running a race. I don't think we understand that in the church. Every one of us are called to run a spiritual race. We see it over and over again. David said in Psalm 19, I rejoice like a strong man preparing to run a race. What did Paul say? I have fought the good fight. I have run the race. I have finished the faith. I've kept the faith. Therefore there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous, shall give me in that day. Come on. As the deer pants for the water brook, even so, Lord, my soul longs after you. If you want the text accurately, it's exactly what's going on. My soul longs after you. I need the water. Why do I need water? Because 60% of my 60% of my body weight's water. I can't live without it. As the deer's panting after water because his body is mostly water, even so, Lord, my soul longs after you. Verse 2, my soul thirsts for the living God. My soul thirsts for God. When shall I come and appear before my God? He is saying this is the prerequisite to my life. This is what my life is all about. You see it so vividly, so obviously during Christmas season when people so misprioritize what the birth of Christ is about. You see the parent frantically scrambling up and down the aisles of Walmart trying to find that just right toy for their child that will break it within 2 weeks. Oh, I want you to see something. Verse 2, verse 3. I want you to look at this in your scriptures. I want you to see this. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before my God? Now watch it. Here it is. They continually say to me, excuse me, where is your God? They continually say to me, where is your God? The question I look at, the obvious question that I see in that statement is, who's the skeptic he's speaking of? Who should be identified as they? They who are continually saying to me, where is your God? Is this simply the outsider savoring in the suffering of the believer? I think David answers the question strangely enough. He goes on to say, follow along with me. My tears have been my food day and night. Who is it that's saying to him, where's your God? I think he's referencing his own sorrow. My sorrow is what's asking the question, where is your God? Have you ever been there? It's not that the naysayer and the unbeliever out here are asking the question. He says that later on in the chapter. The outsider's asking me, where is my God? But the biggest opposition that I face is my tears. My tears are my food. My tears are my drink. And it's my tears asking me that nagging, persistent question. All right, anger, where is your God? Tell me something, Job. Where is your God? Tell me something, David. Where is your God? Tell me, Dewey. Where is your God? Tell me, Gary. Where is your God? Your tears testify to the fact that your God hasn't heard you or your God doesn't care. Where is your God? I love this. Now watch it. I think this is so important. Because it's at a moment like this when we begin to feel the pain of our own personal struggle, we begin complaining. Notice, David never voices a word of ingratitude. David never says, God, you've done me dirty. Watch it. Now watch this. He never expresses a word of malice toward Absalom, toward his advisors, or the very citizens he led against Goliath and the freedoms he afforded them and the financial prosperity he brought them. He never says an unkind word to the people that turned their back on him. Man, that's incredible character. Because if that's me, I'm going to waylay them with my tongue. I'm going to reach into my vocabulary and pull out every adjective I can possibly conjure up to let them know just how sorry they are and that they don't deserve the oxygen they breathe. But he doesn't criticize the people that have turned against him. He doesn't even criticize his own lack of success. What does he do? He focuses not on the problem, but instead he focuses with laser beam clarity on the only solution possible. Verse 6, oh God, my soul is cast down within me. Look at verse 6. God, my soul is cast down within me. Therefore will I remember you. In verse 7, notice that his memory instigates his petition. Deep calls unto deep. As the deer is panting for the water brook. My tears have been my food day and night. Why be downcast? My soul, remember the Lord. Deep calls unto deep in the roar of your waterfall. As the waves and the breakers crash over me. What's deep? When he says deep calls unto deep, it's got a twofold meaning. First of all, he's speaking here about the fathomless caverns of the ocean bottom. And you know that the bottom of the ocean is totally dark. You know that. It's completely black. He's talking about the furthest recesses in the ocean deep. In other words, he uses this analogy because he's telling the Lord, God, I've lost my footing. I used to love the ocean. I've told this story before. I used to love the ocean until in the late 1990s, Denise and I took our kids over to the Atlantic Ocean outside of Wilmington, and I was standing in waters that were below my knee, and my two kids, and I was kind of playing with the two kids, and the two kids were so young, and I got caught in a riptide. And it's one thing if you get caught in the riptide and you're by yourself. They say you just ride the riptide out. I had two little kids that could not swim. Two little kids. Had my foot had gone down, I would have lost my two children. And at that moment, I thought, well, I like to go to the ocean now, but I walk the beach. I'm not too crazy about swimming in the waters. And that's exactly what David is saying. Deep calls unto deep. How do I know the deep? Because I've lost my footing. The waves have overtaken me. I've been plunged to the bottomless caverns of the ocean deep. And in the deep of my despair, in the deep of these ocean waters, I call unto the deep of God. That's what it means. Deep calls to deep. From the deep of my despondency, I call to the depths of God's mercy. Deep calls from the depths of despair to the depths of God's riches. Deep calls unto deep. What's he saying? He recognizes the key to victory is the change in his perspective. In other words, the human need is great, but God's goodness is greater. The human need may be deep, but the grace of God is greater still. Deep calls unto deep. Therefore, he says in verse 5, why be downcast, my soul? Why are you disquieted in me? Put your hope in God. In other words, he's saying human wisdom is shallow. He is saying divine counsel, though, is unsearchable. Let me give you Romans chapter 11 and verse 33, and I'm almost finished. If you're watching us by the internet today and you've got a question about anything I've discussed, man, you don't know about this whole Christian thing. You don't know about this whole God thing. You're not sure about religion in general. There's an email address that you're going to see on the screen. I invite you, just write me a note. Give me your contact information, and I will get back in touch with you right away. If you live in the greater Fort Worth area, I will come out and I will meet with you. If you live somewhere else in the country, give me your contact information. I'll dialogue with you. It's crazy. We've got people writing in from the West Coast and the East Coast. It's amazing where the internet will go. Deep calls unto deep. You say, man, Anger, I hear what you're saying. I feel something deep down inside of me. But what is that? You know you're in a lost place. You know that you don't have the answer. So it's the deep of you crying out to the deep of God. And I'm here to point you to the deep of God's riches. The unsearchable, unknowable, unfathomable riches that are found only in Christ Jesus. And that's what Paul said in Romans 11 and 33. Oh, the depth of the riches. And oh, the depth of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his truths, and how inscrutable are his ways. God's thoughts are immeasurable. I love what the psalmist said in Psalm 92 and verse 5. It was so simple. He said, Lord, your thoughts are very deep. Write it down, Psalm 92 verse 5. Lord, your thoughts are very deep. And then over in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 18 and 19, we discover through the writing of the Apostle Paul that God's riches, the depth of his wisdom and counsel, is unquantifiable. He makes this statement, may you be able to comprehend. Listen to that. May you be able to comprehend with all believers. There's your problem. The inability to comprehend what? What is the width? What is the length? What is the breadth? And what is the height of the love of Christ that passes all knowledge? Deep calls unto deep. The deep of my despair and the deep of my human need cries out to the width, the length, the breadth, and the height of God's knowledge that passes all human understanding. I want to give you the words of two authors, and if you don't mind, Aaron, put the picture of the book Handfuls of Purpose up on the board. It was written by a guy named James Smith. This is a classic Christian book. I highly advise that you find it and you buy it. You can find it on Google very easily. It's written by a guy named James Smith and Robert Lee. And I think in their book, they masterfully articulate the reason that we go through the process of deep crying unto deep. Every one of us in this room are going to face an Absalom kind of abandonment and betrayal. And you can either complain, you can either say, woe is me, God, you've done me dirty, or you can simply say, deep calls unto deep. Let the deep of my despair be the catalyst that brings me into the deep of God's wisdom. It's up to you. This is what the men said. The deep of man's need calls to the deep of God's fullness. And the deep of God's fullness calls to the deep of man's need. Between our emptiness and his all-sufficiency, there is a great gulf. Deep calls unto deep. The deep mercy of God needs our emptiness, into which it might pour itself. Nothing can fully meet the depth of our need but the depth of his almighty fullness. Deep calls unto deep. What you're going through, lady, listen, I don't know what you're going through. Maybe nothing. I suspect, though, sometime in the course of the next 12 months, you're going to feel like you've lost your footing and the moorings have gone out from underneath. It's either your opportunity to complain or your opportunity to learn. What choice will you make? Because this right here produces riches. Unsearchable, unknowable, unfathomable, without width, length, depth, or height. Riches that you can't tap into otherwise. Reminds me of the story of a guy by the name of Conrad Reed. I used to live in North Carolina. And over in North Carolina, years ago, there was a man by the name of Conrad Reed. And on the family farm, he found a rock, a 17-pound rock. He liked the rock. He thought the rock was attractive. And so what he did was he took the rock and actually, not knowing what it was made of, he used it as a doorstep for the family home. He used the rock for a doorstep in the family home. But in 1802, his father, John Reed, decided that this stone was special. This rock was different. And he decided to take the rock and have it identified. The jeweler looked at the rock and instantly he knew what it was. He said, this is gold. For 3 years, the Reed family, was using a 17-pound rock of gold as their family doorstep. But deep calls unto deep. You know what? Somebody pull out a calculator. I don't have this in front of me, and I'm not that good at math. You have it? 17 pounds of gold. Hold on a second. All right, there's 14 and a half, just put 14.5. There's 14 and a half troy ounces in a pound of precious metals. So put 14.5. No, 14.5 times 1,513. That's what the price of gold is at the close of market on Friday. So put in 1,513. Got it? Multiply that by 14.5. Let's see. This is not a hard equation to do. 14.1 ounce. Okay. 14. Wait a minute. And then multiply that. Get that, and then multiply that by 17. 14.5 times 1513 times 17. That sounds right. The guy was using a piece of rock valued at $373,000 as the family doorstep. Did it for 3 years until Dad said, wait a minute, that looks a little bit different. Those are the riches. Man, the riches of God are in front of us, and we miss them. The riches of God are there for the taking, but we miss them because in our deep, instead of crying out to His deep, we complain and we murmur and we find fault. Deep cries unto deep in the roar of God's waterfalls as His waves and His breakers sweep over us. God bless you guys this morning. It is the last Sunday of 2019.